Hi everyone, my name is Louise Moana KOLFF and I'm a lecturer in graphic design. My research interest focuses on the notion of taboo in relation to graphic design. I grew up in Denmark and now call Australia home. The title of this paper is Navigating Contemporary Complexities in the Design of Sexuality Education Materials. I'll be looking at 3 books about how babies are made aimed at young children. In comparing these books, I explore specifically how the increased complexity of sexuality education in current times has influenced the way in which these books are designed. I'm interested in sexuality education because it is an area fraught with complexity, conflict, and awkwardness, and therefore a fascinating area of visual culture. As adults, we all have a sexuality education story, whether positive or negative. The story of how babies come to be were taught to us by parents, teachers, friends, or discovered in other ways. Whatever the story, chances are it at some point involved visual material. Here's a photo of my first sexuality education experience, and a photo of my daughter reading the same book many years later. Sexuality education is generally discussed and researched in relation to the field of education and the field of public health. In the field of education, the goal is to communicate the right information in an age-appropriate way. In the field of public health, the goal is to assist children and young people to make healthy choices. Rarely do we look at sexuality education as a graphic design problem. However, because most of the resources use visual communication, I would argue that it is crucial to explore the topic in the context of graphic design. If sex ed resources are not designed well, the educational and the public health objectives will not be effectively communicated. Designing sexuality education materials is not an easy task. The designer must ensure that the materials are engaging, interesting, educational, and age-appropriate to communicate effectively to children. In the meantime, the designer must also take into account the opposing forces of society which oscillate between more liberal and more conservative ideas in relation to teaching children about sexuality. Designers must find a way to accommodate those who believe sexuality education must start early, must use plain, straightforward language, and must be diverse and inclusive, and those who believe that sexuality should not be taught to children or should be taught as late as possible on a need-to-know basis only and should be discussed within the more traditional constructs of heteronormative reproduction. Alongside these complexities, designers of sexuality education resources in contemporary society are faced with ever more complex stories of sexuality and reproduction. When sexuality education was first officially introduced as a concept in the late 19th and early 20th century, the story was pretty simple. Sex happened for reproduction only between a married heterosexual couple. Only biological explanations were needed. From the 1970s onwards, ideas of sexual pleasure were also introduced. In contemporary society, new ways of conceiving and giving birth have changed the story of how babies are made, and a myriad of new family structures and diverse views on gender have increased the complexity of the possible stories that need to be told. Other issues such as body awareness, questions of consent, pleasure, relationships, and pornography also need to be addressed. In this paper, I've looked at 3 books, all aimed at young children, telling the story of how babies come to be. Per Holm Knudsen's book, from Denmark, first published in 1971, is seen as one of the first to explore reproduction in a straightforward, no-nonsense manner, including the idea of pleasure and sexuality. Fiona Katauskas, an illustrator from Australia, created a book when she got frustrated with a lack of good resources to teach her own kids about reproduction. She's focused on including explanations of many of the new complexities discussed in the previous slide. Canadian Corey Silverberg with illustrator Fiona Smith created a book which aims to be inclusive of all family structures and children. As a gay man himself, Silverberg found it difficult to find books that were relevant to some of his transgender friends who were having children. This book can be read to their children, but also to any other children, as the basic story remains the same. When representing bodies, the three books take very different approaches, from the simple mother and father depiction to the intimate depiction of female anatomy to the entirely gender-neutral depiction of bodies. In Knudsen's 1971 book, bodies are portrayed simply. We see the body of the mother and the father, and then we see the mother's body changing during pregnancy. The body of the mother and father are essentially the same, apart from different hair, different genitalia, and breasts. In Katowska's book, she has fun with showing the changes in bodies during puberty and how men and women are different. In this illustration, for example, the clown has clown pubes. Her book is full of little moments like that of humour which diffuse some of the seriousness associated with quite complex subject matter. On a more serious note, Katowska explains how she was annoyed at the way that boys' and men's genitalia are usually shown in the cross-section and from the front, and the girls' and the women's genitalia is usually shown from the front or as a cross-section of a fallopian tubes and uterus, but never shown from below. This means that girls don't have a good idea of what their actual genitalia looks like. She wanted girls to feel more empowered and have a better understanding of their anatomy. This prompted this illustration, which she sees as one of the more controversial images of the book. Silverberg and Smith's approach to visualizing bodies is entirely different. They wanted to make the bodies shown completely gender neutral. By focusing on the fact that some bodies have sperm and some bodies have eggs, the gender of these people becomes irrelevant. As a result, any person can see themselves in these figures regardless of gender, appearance, and ethnicity. Instead of focusing on the bodies themselves, Silverberg and Smith focus on the genetic codes or stories that are stored in the sperm and the egg, and on how they tell a story about the person they come from. This allows parents who've used sperm or egg donors, or even surrogate mothers or adoption, to still tell their specific family story of conception. When telling the story of conception, the three books again show different approaches to dealing with complexity. In this well-known book from the 1940s, thought to be progressive for its time, Cyril Beebe describes conception in relation to animals and then relates this to human conception. The reproductive organs of rabbits and other animals are displayed, and cross-sections of human anatomy can also be seen. Reproduction is not shown, but described as strictly biological between a married heterosexual couple. Knudsen's book is one of the first, and for a long time only, to show the sexual act itself in a cross-section, and simultaneously he describes the pleasure the men and women are feeling. His book changed the perceptions about the kind of images that are perceived to be acceptable to show young children within sexuality education. It was printed in many languages and still being reprinted in Denmark today. "44 years later, most sexuality education books for children still show the sex scene as happening under blankets. Katowska's, taking inspiration from books like Knudsen's, creates a similar scene where the couple are shown making love and a cross-section illustrates what's happening inside. In an interview, Katowska describes how she wanted the couple to look loving and happy without being overly lusty. In this way, pleasure becomes part of the story. As well as the traditional conception scene, Katalskis also focuses on new forms of reproduction such as IVF, sperm and egg donation. These are complex stories for children to understand, but need to be included at a time where many children are conceived using IVF. When trying to create a book that could be read by all families, including his transgender, gay and lesbian friends who were having kids, Silverberg wanted to include imagery that did not focus on the mother and father themselves, but rather on a sperm and an egg meeting, whether in a test tube or in a uterus. The focus here is on the components needed to make a baby, a sperm, an egg, and a body to grow in. By keeping it open, any family configuration can identify itself in the story. In Silverberg and Smith's book, when the sperm and the egg meet, they tell stories together of the people they came from. This may be stories of the people who are raising the child, or it may be stories of the people who provided the sperm and the egg. How the story is told remains up to the family reading the book. The three books provide insights into the changing nature of birth stories. In Knudsen's birthing scene, a traditional setup for its time sees a male doctor present at the birth, with a mother passive on her back and the father passive at her side. Knudsen got criticism at the time from feminists who were dissatisfied with the depiction. In Katalska's birthing scene, everyone is actively participating. The mother is pushing, the midwife is receiving, and the father is supporting. A caesarean birth is also shown. Silverberg and Smith, like Katalskis, also show two birthing scenes, one at home and a caesarean hospital birth. The difficulty in this scene for Silverberg and Smith was showing the birthing person as gender neutral. Silverberg has transgender male friends who have given birth. He therefore did not want to portray the birthing person as female. Setting the scene as viewed from above allowed for any person regardless of gender to identify with the birthing person. Again, a simplification of the visuals allows for a more inclusive reading, where someone who identifies as male or someone who identifies as female can see themselves in the birthing person. As the story of how babies are made has increased in complexity, designers are taking different approaches to tell children these stories. Some, like Katalskis, aim to tell about these complexities in more detail so that children have a better understanding of what they mean. Others, such as Silverberg and Smith, are working to simplify the story to such an extent that it becomes fully inclusive of any family's lived experience. By exploring how designers of sexuality education resources respond to changes in complexity, we can better understand the decision-making that is shaping this area of visual culture, and have a meaningful discussion about how we want our children to learn about sexuality. That's it for me. Thanks for listening, everyone. I look forward to hearing any questions or comments.